We keep coming back to how we should probably listen to individuals about how technology affects them, and we should collect information from them about what they would like technology to do and how they would like it to be governed.
Welcome everyone to this webinar on programmed racism, organized by the Global Digital Cultures at the University of Amsterdam. And to get the discussion going, we have three great speakers. We have Sennay Ghebreab, Payal Aurora, and Lonneke Taylor.
Face recognition technology has been developed and used for almost 2 decades, even more than that. The technology uses algorithms that learn to recognize distinctive biometric facial features, such as distance between the eyes or the length and the shape of lips, based on sample pictures or videos of faces. And now that institutional racism has entered the public consciousness, even the American tech giants like Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft have put the brakes on the development of facial recognition technology. The growing measures against facial recognition are based on 2 different concerns. First is the concern that this technology does not work properly and fairly. And the second is the fear, increasing fear, that this technology would work too well and too fairly. Even worse than misidentification may be the fact that time and again it appears that facial recognition technology disadvantages one population group more than the other. To begin with, the errors made by facial recognition technologies are not equally distributed across population groups. African Americans and Asian faces are misidentified up to 100 times more than white faces, partly and perhaps predominantly because the data sets used to train the algorithms are not representative. Unfair technology and unfair use of that technology doubly disadvantage people of color.
But I would like to focus on the other term, which is even more important, is racism, as a key lens to highlight systems of exclusion and inclusion. How can we change that paradigm? The concern is very important, and however, it does miss a very important thing, is that the intersectionality of marginalization, which compounds and amplifies certain forms of discrimination over others when we take into account class, gender, religion, and a variety of other forms. If you look at what's happening in India, I would say a lot of it is about class, it's compounded with gender. In fact, gender is extraordinarily heavy weight and criteria that is sieving these systems and influencing how people get discriminated on. I feel like we are all we're all wanting the same thing, is we want to look at underlying systems of exclusion and inclusion. But I think it's really essential that we start to broaden these parameters beyond the American context of what's going on right now. Because while that is very important, what I am very afraid of is that race becomes a dominant characteristic. And if anything, even from the conversations that are going on in the global South, there's a certain sense of superiority in their culture that look at the Americans, they are so divided and we actually support them. And this is also, you see this in India, they're like, we really support, and people are like, hang on, aren't you like advertising this whitening cream? So, because they're like, yeah, race this is not our issue. We don't do race because we're not racist, because this doesn't exist in India, right? And this kind of can actually close a conversation, which is very important. And so I really believe we need to have a sort of global perspective to these conversations and broaden it in terms of systems of inclusion and exclusion, which are not fixed or not complete, because it's never is, right? Because we need to be within a politics of hope.
On our project in the Global Data Justice Project, we try to look at the ways in which tech sort of reproduces and amplifies injustice across different regional and country contexts in order to get insights about exactly the things that Sennay and Payal have been discussing just now. One of the things that we're looking at is the way that lower income countries and lower income populations around the world are being used as basically lab rats to develop tech, including AI, that then gets scaled up to the global market. So there's already this established culture of technological experimentation on refugees and migrants and recipients of welfare programs. But now technology vendors around the world have kind of internalized this logic, and they're optimizing for the interests of not just states, but also the technology industry itself. So this is a really interesting way to approach the debates that are landing in certain places as debates about technology and racism. And as Payal correctly says, that are landing in other places as debates about exclusion and injustice based on class and caste and place of origin. So examples of inclusion problems that we're seeing particularly focus around migration, actually. So I was at a meeting back in 2015, I was at a meeting on humanitarian data here in the Netherlands. And I was approached by this very senior Microsoft executive who thought I might be a policymaker. And he explained the company was making proposals to European police and government authorities to use its new Azure AI, which is now quite an old system. The way they envisaged this system being tested would be on Syrian refugees waiting at the Hungarian border to be allowed into the EU. And that you could analyze all of their social media posts and video posts to try and figure out what their future mobility plans were, and to feed that to European border authorities. And the pitch he made was literally this. He said, a refugee camp is essentially something you can treat as a prison for analytical purposes. People will eventually come out, and the aim is then to track them, to know what they're doing, and to prevent them from offending again. And he's talking about Syrian refugees who were at that point freezing and starving to death on the Hungarian border in 2015.
Unfair and overly fair facial recognition technologies have become mainstream technologies over the past 20 years and are now slowly reaching public consciousness. And the result is public outrage and a call for a ban on automatic facial recognition. But isn't removing data sets or banning facial recognition technology a pseudo solution or even a distraction, so that other AI technologies can be further developed outside of public attention and scrutiny?
But I find them to be this whole notion of innately positive and innately negative sort of connotations of inclusion and exclusion are not useful. I would actually go a step further, is what was that system built for? What is the outcome that is desired? And in which case, similar to my context on the biometric identity project, that per se is not a negative or positive thing, because it's playing out in very complex and different ways amongst different populations, different industries. There's a lot of like different sort of intersecting of these components. And so it is very useful to demoralize the systems of inclusion and exclusion and not have them linked to these sort of, simplistic rubrics of the positive and the negative.
I really see two parallel worlds at work here, and I want both of them to exist, right? There's a world of tech developers who are seeking like positive ways to use tech and to fight battles using technology. And they're engaged in these really profound discussions around data literacy and empowerment through education and inclusive tech development. So that's one entire field. Separately, there's a different field that discusses issues about corporate agglomeration of power on the global level, and that looks at how that power affects what tech can be developed and scaled up and used on the population level. So when we look at big tech, corporations negotiate with states as if they themselves were states at this point. They're welcomed as technology research funders along with the state in academia, and they're welcomed as venture capitalists determining which startups can succeed. So where they invest determines what type of tech can get developed, where information lives, whose cloud, whether it's the cloud or local, where data gets nationalized and localized, what tech can get developed and applied on a general level. So I think if we want to think about justice and about what an anti-racist technology development paradigm could look like, we need to think about both stimulating power from the bottom up, as Sennay was describing, and also controlling power from the top down, and thinking about the relationship between technology providers and the state. So I think both are really important, but they do different jobs, and we shouldn't conflate them.